Alex, and thank you so much for having me. I don't know if there's a museum in America of this size and this size down that does as much as the Massillon Museum. You guys, for those of you who are around here, you know that, right? So I'm very pleased to be here. I've been here before, but I'm happy to be here. And thanks so much for coming out. My daughter and my wife are here, so they can attest that one time I had a presentation in Long Beach, California. Flew all the way out there. I got ready to talk, and my audience was 2 people. My wife. And my daughter at the time was about, 9 months old or so?
Barely.
And as soon as she started hearing me speak, she started crying. And so my audience got reduced down to 0. That was a long ways to go to talk to no one. So I am so glad anytime there's an audience. Alright, so I'm going to be careful here too because my daughter is here. But so this is Eugene Debs, and as you'll notice, he's a convict. And his parents would have been horrified by this thought growing up. He grew up in a pretty semi-respectable family in Terre Haute, Indiana. The thought of him being a convict, I think they probably wanted him to be a bank vice president or something like that. And instead, he ended up in prison a couple different times.
And they decided once you started the presentation, to just go to sleep.
There we go. All right. So, and Laura's here too. Laura's one of my students, and she was in my honors class last year, and we were talking about crime and punishment. And honor students are very good students, and they're very good people, and they've done everything right in their lives. And I think at some point I got kind of frustrated, and I said something like, "Well, don't you think there's things getting worth getting arrested for?" And the look on their faces of sheer horror. No, nothing is worth getting arrested for. Eugene Debs would disagree. And when we go through the presentation and we see the things he was arrested for, we wonder if he was on the right side of the law during these times. So this story starts on the south side of Chicago. Chicago, during the Industrial Revolution, was a mess. It was not a healthy place to live. It was overcrowded. So this guy here, George Pullman, decided to create a model town on the south side of Chicago. It was on the outskirts of the time. And he had the Pullman Company, which made palace cars, made rail cars. And he thought it was a good idea to make this model town. And at the time, it was a really good idea. And I think at first his workers really liked it. He designed their housing. He designed recreation areas. He designed a theater. This was going to be a model town for his employees. And like I said, I think at first his employees were so happy to get out of the congestion and filth of Chicago that they enjoyed it. But slowly they started to figure out that this was, he was sort of a King Lear type of character who wanted to control every single thing about their lives. This is a history happy hour, so of course it's worth mentioning one thing he banned from his town was alcohol. Of course, there would be no alcohol in his town, and everyone just sipped right after that. Everything came with a price, everything. So you wanted to play on the company recreation, well, that came out of your paycheck. You lived in his housing, that came out of your paycheck. He even would check their homes to make sure that they were being clean, and those things could come out of your paycheck. After a while, the workers began to realize that everything was controlled by George Pullman. And as economic hard times hit, he would cut wages and raise rents. And then they really started to feel like he was controlling everything. We quote great people a lot in America. I like to quote average people, and this quote is so perfect right here. We are born in a Pullman house, cradled in a Pullman crib, paid from a Pullman store, taught in a Pullman school, confirmed in a Pullman church, exploited in a Pullman shop, and when we die, we'll be buried in a Pullman grave and go to a Pullman hell. They went out on strike. Finally, it got to be too much, especially when he continued to raise rents for the housing that he owned while cutting wages. And this was another one of those major strikes in American history that happened in the late 1800s. It started out as a local thing. It became a national thing. it involved the railway. This is how we get to the connection to the railway exhibits here. And a lot of workers in sympathy with the Pullman workers went on strike as well, and it became a national strike. Some people in the federal government owned a lot of stock in the Pullman company. And you can see where this is going. Federal troops intervened. Eugene Debs was one of the officials for the unions involved here, the American Railway Union. He ends up in prison for the first time here, in jail for the first time in his life. The charge, interfering with the mail. This is how the federal government justified intervening in the strike. Back then, all the mail went over the rail lines. The strikers were interfering with the mail, had to shut down the strike somehow, so the charge was interfering with the mail. Eugene Debs ends up in jail. To this point, yes, Eugene Debs was a unionist, but he very much saw himself as a respectable, middle-class unionist. A person that was going to fit in society. Again, I think at this point his parents still hope he'd be a bank vice president or something like that someday. A person that hobnobbed with business people. In jail, this is where he becomes radicalized. He starts reading Marx, and by the time he leaves jail, according to him anyways, he's a socialist. And he runs for president several times. This was his most successful run for president. He becomes the most prominent socialist in America, in part because he's such a fantastic speaker. And when we come later on, I don't know if you've ever read any of his speeches, but they just go on and on and on. People must have had so much more patience back then. I see some of my students in class. I feel like I've got them for about 20 minutes. That's max, right? His speeches went on and on and on, and immigrants would come to his speeches not knowing any English, and his speeches were in English. And they would ask these immigrants afterwards, why would you possibly come to listen to this guy speaking? And they would say, Comrade Debs speaks with his heart and his hands, and they could understand what he was saying, even though they couldn't even speak English. A different time, perhaps, right? But this was his most successful run. This is one of our most interesting elections, 1912. He gets 6% of the vote as a socialist. A four-way election. William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Eugene Debs. Fascinating election. Three of which running as progressives. Debs thought of himself as a progressive socialist, Wilson as a progressive, Teddy Roosevelt as a progressive as well. Taft not so much. But a progressive time in America, 6% of the vote is a socialist, and I'm sure for those of you who live in America know that that's the high watermark for socialism in America. Then this breaks out in Europe, and man, 100th anniversary of the Great War, a whole bunch of books have come out. Historians, let's take advantage of this 100-year anniversary, try to sell some books. And I try to read some of them, I'm trying to get through some of these books, and my goal is, because I have students, and the students always ask, why did World War I break out? And so I went and read all these books. I still have no idea why this war happened. A series of mistakes leading to a horrific situation. The United States, Woodrow Wilson, this guy right here who won in 1912, runs for re-election in 1916, and a major part of his platform is, I'm going to keep us out of this war. As you can see by his buttons right there. War in Europe, peace in America, God bless Wilson. This is a major reason he's elected. Most Americans want nothing to do with this war. The reports are coming back from Europe on how horrific it is. However, there's a lot of pushing back and forth in America that we should enter this war. The Founding Fathers were pretty clear on staying out of European problems. Don't go get entangled in foreign problems. Don't go looking for monsters to slay overseas. So there was that thrust in America, let's not get involved. But there was also just a lot of immigrants that had moved to America and thought something needed to be done. And I think what's so interesting is that they were making arguments on both sides. There were a ton of German Americans here. I just saw a map the other day of America and it showed what's the dominant ethnic group in just about every state, and Germans across the country. And they were making a loud argument that yes, we should be in this war, but we should be on the side of the Germans. And certainly being in Ohio here, you can understand that. Columbus, Cincinnati, people are saying, yeah, let's do this, but on the Central Powers side. Others said, no, let's stay out. Others said, it's time to go in on the Allied power side. But I think that's so interesting, isn't it? To think about, I think most times when we think about a war, we think, well, here's the good side, and here's the bad side. But during this time, they were actually having a debate on which side was the good side and the bad side. And let's not be colored about what happened during World War II. The Germans were not the Nazis. It was a completely different situation. But there's that unfortunate incident right there where Archduke Franz Ferdinand is about to step in that car and get assassinated and start World War I. Again, not a good enough reason for the amount of killing that went on during the Great War. And this right here should tell us all we need to know about World War I. Look how much they look alike, right? It's crazy. And they would write each other and they would say, how are you doing, Nicky? This is your cousin Willie. And this is, the royal family in England had such problems during this era, World War I and World War II, because they had such a thick German accent that they would try to rally English people, and pretty hard to do when you've got that thick German accent. They had to change their name, right? It became the House of Windsor during this time. That's not their name, it's a German name. Oh, yeah. So much inbreeding by this point. That the hemophilia, I think there's good evidence now that the hemophilia that the Russian family had is probably because there'd been so much inbreeding in the royal family by this time. Why get involved in this? Why get involved? And the stories were starting to come over from Europe about how this war was being fought. And many of you will probably be familiar with this, but down there in those trenches that didn't move for months, and then some officer gets up and blows the whistle, and everybody runs out of the trench. And the tactics were old tactics, the technology was new. You run out of that trench, and you are mowed down by a machine gun. Old tactics, new technology. I think that's a big part of the reason this was such a horrible war. But why don't you just stay in the trench? Well, we know as well that the chemical warfare during this time, that the gas would often go down in the trenches, leading to just wiping out entire units. So again, why join this war? We got Wilson saying, I ran for president on I'm going to keep us out of this war. We have entrenched royal families, and neither side is really fighting for any sort of democracy. There were a lot of German Americans, there were a whole lot of Irish Americans, I'm one of them, who said, you want to join this on the side of the British? Are you serious? The people that just put down the Easter Uprising and are denying us independence, that's not the side of democracy. And so what Wilson had to do, and there's just no doubt about it, was overwhelming amounts of propaganda to try to convince Americans that this was the right thing to do. And it's incredible how the United States shifted from isolation to yes, we need to get in this war, and it was through force and through propaganda. I've often wondered how German Americans felt about a poster like this, especially where just a year earlier they were confident enough to say, yes, we should be in this war and we should be on the side of Germany, and now to see themselves depicted in this manner. And still communicating with people that lived in Germany, in a lot of cases, still talking to their families, and now they're being depicted in this manner. Hollywood Hollywood jumped in with both feet. Just, when Wilson dispatched his people to Hollywood and said, we need to be in this war, it's rather amazing how fast Hollywood just said, yeah, we're in this, and started making over-the-top movies like this. Wilson didn't think this was going far enough, and so this is when he really starts to crack down on dissent and peace movement. And I think there were a lot of people just suffering from vertigo here. You told us you want to go into the war, and now you're saying we have to go into the war, and a horrible war. And so there were a lot of people speaking out on this. And 2 acts passed here, one Espionage Act, and the second Sedition Act, which is going to get Debs. But complicated situations, but really broadly written. And Espionage Act, for instance, said you can't interfere with the recruitment of troops. And the way that was understood by some people looking to go get the peace movement was anything that you say against the war, you could end up in serious trouble. Rose Pastor Stokes, from a prominent family, wrote a letter to the Kansas City Star, a letter to the editor. When you go read the letter, it's so mild. She just said, no, I don't think this is a good idea to get into this war. It's not fire-breathing at all. 10 years in prison. Kate Richards O'Hare from North Dakota gave a speech against the war, 5 years in federal prison. Neither of them actually served the full term, but both of them. What a message to the peace movement. Speak out, and you're done for. And this leads us to here in Stark County, and our guy, Eugene Debs. Leader of the socialist movement, clearly anti-war during this time. And he comes to Canton 100 years ago, and it was a celebration this summer. 100th anniversary of him speaking right here in Minnesota Park. Again, a tremendously long speech. He just went on and on and on. I don't know what it was like, the weather was like on June 16th in Minnesota Park, but people just must have had a lot of patience for going out in the park and listening. He knew, he was no fool, he knew what was going on. And he said, almost at the beginning of the speech, I realize that in speaking this afternoon, there are certain limitations placed upon the right of free speech. We'll just think about that sentence for a moment. And then he goes on to say, no, I've got some things in mind and I'm not going to say them. And then he went on and said them anyways. But after that, I really like what he says here, and this is the title of my speech here. Right? I would rather be 1,000 times be a free soul in jail than be a sycophant and a coward in the streets. I think he knew, well, he knew that there were spies all over the place. He knew that people were just waiting for him to say the wrong thing so they could get in. The Canton prosecutor ignored it, more or less. The Canton media did not jump on, even though the repository was quite conservative and supportive of the war, the Canton repository did not jump on him. A media member from Cleveland, and then later on a prosecutor from Cleveland, looking to make his name, is the one that went and came and got him and arrested him. And he was put on trial under the Sedition Act for speaking out. You know, again, you probably don't have time to read his whole speech because it goes on and on and on, but it was really pretty mild as well. A little bit in there about this war is for munitions manufacturers, it's going to get a lot of people rich, and it's not for the working class. But nothing inflammatory, right? Nothing that would have thrown people off completely. But it was enough for him to be tried up in Cleveland. And this weekend, some of my colleagues are having a celebration, perhaps, of this trial. They're going to reenact some of the trial. And he was sentenced guilty under the Sedition Act. The First Amendment apparently disappeared here. He was allowed to address the court, which I think they regretted that at the minute. They knew he would just go on and on and on, but he was allowed to address the court. And here's what he said. Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then and I say now that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. My students, who they're into history, and they're like, who's your history hero? And I try to say, I really don't get into that stuff. I think we're all humans. There are people that are courageous and things, but people are flawed too. And I don't get into hero worship too much. But then when it comes to Eugene, it's a bromance, a man crush perhaps I have on Eugene Debs, stuff like that. It moves me, honestly. It moves me when he speaks. Sent to prison. The very sad thing here is that all those rail workers who he had worked so hard to give a living wage and a decent life in America are the ones that then transported him to federal prison, and they knew it and they talked about it. How can we do this? We are putting the guy that has given us a middle-class lifestyle, and we are transporting him to prison, and they felt so guilty about it, but they did it anyways. I went to West Virginia for a stretch, and then he went into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and he runs for president. Of course, right? Why not? He's in prison, he runs for president. Question? Yeah.
How old is he?
Yeah, he's pretty aged. In fact, I don't know his exact age, but prison was very hard on his health as well. He really suffered from this in this period. 1 million votes from prison. 1 million votes from prison, about 3% of the total. Way down from 6% in 1912. But nevertheless, 1 million votes, very impressive. And his supporters rolled giant barrels of petitions to the White House, to Woodrow Wilson's White House, saying, let this guy out, this is vindictive and ridiculous. Wilson was incapacitated at the end of his presidency, but he was also just mean by the end of his presidency, and he was having none of it. And his Attorney General, Eamon Joe Palmer, none of it either. He wanted to run for president in 1920, and he wanted to show how tough he could be on these peaceniks, and so he was not having it at all. Did you have a question?
Yeah, was that an original campaign?
I believe this is.
Or was that an attack ad?
Yeah, right. No, I believe this is the original one. Yeah, this is one of those collector's items that they were making a statement. Right? They were making a statement about the First Amendment, about him being in prison, and they left no doubt. His running mate would visit him. I have several pictures. I don't think, but his running mate would visit him in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and they would stage photo ops, things like that. Naturally, being a union organizer, he organized the prisoners inside the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Right? He's like, well, while I'm here, I might as well organize the prisoners. Right? Question?
Debs was 65 when he ran for
65, yeah.
Thank you.
And back then, so yeah, he was pretty old, and it was really hard on his physical strength. This guy from Ohio, who didn't do much of anything during his presidency. But remember, he had a lot, yes. A real ladies' man, that is very true. His platform was normalcy. That was his exciting platform to run as president. But following Woodrow Wilson, and how Woodrow Wilson just made a mess out of so many things, I think this was so appealing to so many Americans. Normalcy. We might see that coming up soon here too. We've had a lot of excitement. There might be just a person that just says, I am the most boring person. I promise I won't go on Twitter. I just and this is what he ran on, normalcy. But he didn't do much either. My high school textbook called Warren Harding, in the high school textbook, an amiable fool. That's rough for a high school textbook. That's probably what it was. But one thing he did do is he pardoned Eugene Debs. And maybe one of his best moments as president. You can see Debs leaving the White House when he was pardoned. I'm going to make two arguments here. What's that? Well, 1921, I believe, is when he got out, so not too long. But it still was very rough on his health. And it was such a silencing message to America, right? This is what's going to happen to you if you speak out. All right, so one, they clearly violated these people's civil rights. First Amendment, it's right there, right? First Amendment. Two, Debs was right on the war. And Rose Pastor Stokes was right on the war. This was a disaster. And some of you are probably familiar with this, but the Treaty of Versailles settled nothing. One of the French ministers that was there, said, this isn't a peace document. It's just a delay of 20 years. And so right. 20 years later, the way they punished Germany, they went over the top, punishing Germany, set up all sorts of problems. The war was not only a disaster. This is the 100th anniversary of Argonne Forest. 26,000 Americans died in that Argonne Forest war. And in the repository, whenever a weekend ago or so, they said, what a smashing victory. I just don't see it. 26,000 Americans died, and for what? There was no peace really. It was just a delay until the next war. So he was right. So not only were they violating his civil rights, but he was right about the war. But I'm going to conclude with the discussion that the Espionage Act is still with us today. In fact, our previous president, President Obama, used it very loosely during his presidency. I believe he used it 7 different times, including going after journalists, including going after this guy right here. And, this is a little bit different, okay, a lot different than Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs did not have government secrets. He worked for the government. He was just merely expressing his opinion as an American citizen. Edward Snowden, who released all those documents, was a contractor. He wasn't actually directly employed by the government. And he released a lot of secret government documents. On the other hand, we found out so much about what our government was doing illegally through his whistleblowing. Did he do the right thing? And I've read all sorts of stuff that says, this what he did was treason. He put people in danger. This stuff. It's not his job to decide what gets released to the American people and what doesn't. And I've read stuff on the other side too. Actually, if you are working inside government and your government is doing something illegally, isn't it your duty to report those things? So the issue of the Espionage Act is still very much with us today. So I'm going to leave you with that question.